Let me introduce David to you, whom I'm sure many of you might know. As co-chair of Outsell's leadership programs, David uses his extensive information industry experience to support Outsell's strategy and business objectives worldwide. He manages Outsell's so-called leadership councils in the US and in Europe. That's a member service for CEOs and for senior executives of media publishing and information provider firms. As a respected thought leader, David is also chairman of Business Information Industry Association, and he speaks frequently at industry conferences and advises clients worldwide. He founded EPS, Electronic Publishing Services, in 1985, a research and consultancy company working with the digital content industry in developing strategies for products and markets in consumer and business sectors. Outsell, where he's working now, acquired EPS in 2006. We have a special feature for you already with the first speaker, with David, whom we welcome now on the stage. Hello, David. He is Mr. Invisible, as you will see. So David had a problem with his camera today. Let's see whether we can still make most of it by listening to his presentation. Hi, David.
Hi, can you hear my voice?
We can.
Oh, good. Because that's the operational part today. Looking at my face is not going to tell you the rest of the story. Shall I begin? Please do, yes. Over to you. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is a wonderful idea and a wonderful conference. And I do welcome you from all parts of the world. My goodness, that's an array of countries, and how good to find parts of the student body in the room as well. I have a central message I want to deliver. You're going to hear from many experts in the next 2 days. You're going to hear people who really know in depth about sectors of this industry. I'm the arch generalist. For many, many, many years, I've been looking at the blue sky vision. And I have to tell you, I have a conclusion at the moment about scholarly communications. We are all looking in the wrong direction. As a group in scholarly communications, we are obsessed by open access. We're obsessed by publishing. The big changes that are coming don't begin in open access. They don't begin in the publishing world. The publishing world is the hand servant of scholarly communications, not the ruler. So where should we look? We should look at open science, and we should look at it very carefully. And for a few minutes, I would like to do that with you. And we should look at it very carefully and say to ourselves, what is the impact of open science policies going to be upon the way scholars communicate? I suggest to you that the prominence of open access on the agenda has to be discussed. It is very important, has really come about through the efforts of the publishing community to rebuild the world that they once knew in a transformative way into something which is quite like the world that they once knew. In one sense, of course, they're right. Not an awful lot has changed in the many years that people like me have been looking at these things. Let me just add a footnote to that. I started my working life in publishing in October 1957 in the great publishing house of Thomas Nelson and Sons, educational and academic publishers in Edinburgh. That's a fair time ago. In that world, there were publishers and there were librarians. And that's what academic publishing was all about, that relationship. Now, one thing has changed. We are living in a world where we are researcher-centric. And that has not come about accidentally. Librarians are, of course, of huge importance, as are the institutions which house all of these people, the universities, the research centres, as, of course, are the people who fund all this research. And also, I would argue, quite important, are the publishers. But let me tell you, I've developed a theory over 50 years that a sort of dance takes place here. You could call it a danse macabre in the relationships of those five players: researchers, librarians, institutions, funders, and publishers. And I've come to envisage it a bit like a sort of musical chairs, that those five players circle each other, knowing that when the music stops, there are only 4 chairs to sit down on. And at the end of this small talk, I am going to tell you just who doesn't have a chair in 5 years' time. So let's concentrate on my central aim, which is to really talk about open science. Open science is a development born of self-recognition, development born amongst scientists themselves, looking at the issues which really concern them in the ethical conduct of their business. We have all known, who have been watching for a long time, we have all known how susceptible, like all human activities, how susceptible science is to distortion. We have all known about reciprocal citation. We have all known about flattering citation. We have all known about some of the issues of the impact factor. We have all known that the basis upon which science is conducted can be bent. We've all heard of journals who don't admit articles that the ruling group don't approve of in the editorial board. There are all sorts of problems. Back in 2004, I got the task as a consultant of running the research work of a British House of Commons committee, the Science and Technology Committee, as it conducted the first in-depth inquiry into open access. One of the witnesses who came to London to be interviewed was Howard Varmus, one of the co-founders of PLOS, the Public Library of Science. Varmus was full of the new ideas of how an ethical science structure could be created. And for him, open access was a part of that. Not all of it, but it was an element of that. It wasn't an end in itself. Open access was simply a stage through which we were going to go. So I would like to just quickly run through what are the other stages through which we're going to run. Well, clearly one of them would be open data. The State of Open Data 2020 report published last week makes it quite clear that we are now well on the way, using FAIR principles, towards good open data practice. And yet, many articles are not published with their associated data. Their associated data is improperly or incorrectly linked to them. There are huge problems around getting the data aligned to the article, to the research report, and to getting the data universally available, and getting the standards of data curation into a proper state. There are also huge issues around the future of the article. I want to talk in a moment about something called pre-registration, but the future of the article has been a subject of debate. I was myself one of a panel of judges on an Elsevier competition 15 years ago, looking at the future of the article. Much has happened. The article has video today. It may have virtual reality. It may have simulation. It may have graphs that can be reworked and the data applied across different axes. Huge amounts of flexibility are coming in to the way the article works. They partly mean that the article can only now be a digital article. And of course, the issue of periodicity of when the article appeared disappeared when printed materials ceased to be the driving force of the scholarly communications article. Open science brings other areas too. Reproducibility, extremely important in this context. More and more articles that report success in reproducing landmark research find a place in publication that they never previously found before. This is exciting, but it changes the criteria by which publications are accepted. Reproducibility can now be simulated in places where evidence can be used in the cloud. So there's an important issue. Annotation becomes an important issue. The work of companies like Hypothesis provide trackways through article collections which can be linked and explored through annotation in a way never possible before. Again, that's an important element in making open science work. And the monograph is being reinvented. Not my subject today, but it's a very, very important one. We all know that a whole industry has grown up in the past few years around preprints. That is an open science mandate about speed, it seems to me. Speed, getting the article into the public attention became absolutely vital. And whether or not that is a fully reviewed article, or whether it's going to be subject to post-publication review, seems to me to be less a concern. I'm also delighted to think that conferences are becoming citable, recordable, and digital transcripts can be available immediately. I'm very impressed by some of the platforms. Undermined, for example, with contributions by scientific scholars, getting DOIs, being fully searchable, that too is a huge push forward. It reminds me that, of course, scientific communication is not solely a subject of articles. It's about blogs. It's about comments. It's about review articles. It's about all sorts of things. And then I think we come to a very interesting ethical point in life sciences. As more and more scientists, a very interesting case study of this at PLOS, as more and more scientists begin to look at pre-registration. Pre-registration in this sense, that being able to state the end purpose of a research program, to write down the hypothesis being tested, and to write down what the aims are and what the expected findings are, and then to publish it prior to commencing the research. That is half of what our present article consists of. And then after that research is completed, then publishing the second half linked to the first, which demonstrates what the research results were. Know what conclusions can be drawn, what findings have been made. So no ability to fudge the issue there, but an ethical statement of how research should be conducted. So what are the impacts of all this going to have upon scholarly communication? First of all, we have to say, we are working in a world of data-driven science. Text is kind of interesting because text is commonly becoming content as data when we are, of course, searching great bodies of it. And there are huge bodies of data now available to search. Not just the evidential data, not just the content as data, but of course, the whole business of performance as data. Who read that article? Who downloaded it? How many page views were taken, etc., etc., etc. So here is a mass of data. So far, we have not made too much progress with it. But I think it's quite easy to say that the days of people seriously reading articles for information are coming to an end and have come to an end in many subjects. For many disciplines in the sciences, machine reading will be the only way you can cope with the volumes of data emerging into the marketplace. Now, this may be a very funny year because of the pandemic and because of people working and writing at home. But Elsevier's article count will be up 25% this year. 11% at Wiley, 13% at Springer Nature. Is that going to go on? Or is that a short-term blip? Whatever, we are increasing the amount of data in the marketplace hugely, year on year on year. And keeping up is by machine intelligence is probably the only way we'll ever cope with the problem. And of course, searching all that data, checking on the major themes that we're looking for, that is one thing. Writing it is quite another. I noticed this in the last week that the Allen Institute have produced the first releases of their robotic summary software. More and more of this data will be created by the machines that read it. And we have to cope with that. That will be hard in much of the handcrafted publishing environments in which we currently work. And then we come to peer review. Of course, you know, this is an area of high controversy, and rightly so, because it's an area where publishers are at their most defensive. It's one of the things they add most. But I've been watching very closely the experimentation which has been taking place, led by Cactus Communications and their Unsilo AI software, installed both at Scholar One and at Wiley and at Springer Nature, to provide technical checks which could have taken junior editors hours to perform, and which now can be extended. There's over 25 of them in place. This helps open science by extending the range of technical testing. It helps the speed of material into circulation by shortening peer review. It helps the marketplace by reducing the costs of peer review. We still, of course, have that wonderful notion that a man or woman with a PhD at the end of the day is going to say that's publishable. I think if peer review survives, it will only survive in the next 5 years as it becomes more and more machine appropriate, more and more using artificial intelligence to assert whether an article is likely to be a star article, is likely to be to attract real attention. Now, let's think a little bit more around that. How does that situation come about? It comes about because we are effectively now in the era of concept searching. You remember keyword searching. You remember the idea of natural language searching. We now move towards concept-based searching. Searching which will allow us to examine forms of words which, if they are not identical in each case, mean much the same thing. Moving into the semantic web, as we are, moving into a world where that form of cognition is effective, gives us a hugely extended scope, and it allows us to search on comparative methodologies. I'm sometimes surprised by publishers who seem to me to think that the only reason why you would search an article would be to find a research outcome. From all the studies that I've ever seen of article searching, a huge proportion of searches on articles are about finding a better methodology, about looking at how other people did it and seeing if what they did and what they learned works for your experimental environment. It does seem to me that publishers will push in this direction if they're wise. I was very struck by the alliance, again, announced last week between BrainSci, an AI company, and Taylor and Francis. That seems to me to be very much the way in which we're going. And the article itself, will it survive being cut in half? Will it survive the new forms of treatment or not new forms of treatment? I noted 15 years ago that in cell signaling, research into the electronic impulses put out by cells, people did not publish articles. They simply applied their analytics, came up with a piece of analysis and applied it to the database shared by the 5 great institutions that do cell signaling research. I was equally impressed at Caltech in their micro-publishing conference this year to see the genomic exemplar databases, the fruit flies, Drosophila, and the nematode worms, and all that sort of, all those experimental life form genomic analysis being done again by the conclusions being given a DOI, cited, and placed against the main body of the research, and made more public in very short articles, micro-publishing. That seems to me to be a very important element of all of this. So, when the music stops, who's going to sit down and who's going to sit down where? Well, of course, the researchers are going to sit down first. They are the vital body of activity that all of us are supporting. They're more and more service acquirers. They are more and more budget holders. They are more and more in many cases, publishers of their own materials. They will seek better tools. They will seek, of course, to advance their reputation through making their work available. But it's not obvious to me that the current publishing scenario is one which will satisfy all of their needs. And the funders, they have assumed through open access, through Coalition S, a much greater prominence and a much greater thrust in all of this. Many of them, I noticed the Dutch government research agency last week, make very strong statements. In this case, accepting the Wellcome Foundation standards on open science. So they're going to push the open science agenda. And they're going to be, I think, very much more forceful in the area of peer review than we've ever seen before. After all, if you've done extensive due diligence, if you've approved a research project, if you have funded it for 5 years, you will want to see its results published. And its results, given that that is often public money, should be published and should be available in an open access environment. The librarians, well, I think librarians have been shifting the ground now for 20 odd years. And I think librarians are the very chameleons of the scholarly communication marketplace. They will change color and they will survive and they will emerge. But they won't emerge as people building collections. They are much more involved in data, in publishing, and in research methodologies than I've ever known before. And I think they will continue to be. Institutions, they will be deeply concerned here about reputation, as much as the researchers. And I think that we will see a great deal more work in the area of impact and dissemination coming out of their concerns. And the publishers, not, I think, so much concerned with content or with peer review. Peer review in the future, I think, is going for them to be a mostly post-publication activity. They will invest in, if they're wise, in AI, in building tool sets, in building data products, in building subset solutions, in building models for virtual experimentation, doing all sorts of other things. And if they survive, the role will not be the sort of journal publishing role that we see today. So let me just draw this back together and put it squarely onto one key technology. If I had to point to a development which I saw as vital to all of this happening, I would point you to the knowledge mapping world of knowledge graphs. As AI moves to allow us to see clearly scholars working in similar directions, researchers connected to each other in terms of the way their work is going, in terms of where the gaps are in the knowledge map, to being able to track the impact and dissemination of knowledge across people, institutions, laboratories. It does seem to me that we have a huge tool in our hands, which has the potential to solve the reputation problem. Does this replace the ways we assess reputation today? The impact factor, things like that? Yes, I think to an extent it does. I well recall working years ago upon the acquisition of ISI by Thomson Reuters, being told by that great man, Gene Garfield, that impact factor was simply the least bad way of measuring whether science was worthwhile. And he said, as I recall, it just tracks something which is universal. It doesn't tell you whether it's good science at the end of the day. So I see knowledge graphs all around us. I think I see people like CCC, the Copyright Clearing Center, building with their colleagues in their member companies. They're working at the moment with 8 publishers on a pilot, building extensive knowledge graph technology. It will bring publishers together and it will make us collaborate, and that will be extremely useful to the survival of the very best of what we do. I see companies, I see institutions like the German Leibniz Institute spending huge amounts in knowledge graph development, and companies like Deep Search 9 pushing to the very edge of search and into the artificial intelligence area. So a lot of activity. Old activities will slowly slip away. We won't even notice, as we have had with the new activities like OA. We will see an almost noiseless revolution take place. But above all, we will see a new attitude towards the ethical basis of scientific research, which changes scholarly communications and in turn repositions all of those 5 players. For my money at the moment, when the music stops, publishers are most at risk. That can be changed, but it needs strategy and investment to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was a really interesting introduction into our conference here today. And let's see whether we all managed to ask you the questions that we discussed. And as we discussed with the technology, please use the chat on the right-hand side of your screen, basically, to type in questions, and I will then use them, read them out, and certainly mention you in the discussion. But before we start opening the floor, David, you were talking about a noiseless revolution, which I find really an interesting term in an industry which is really good at creating a lot of noise about itself, and not just about the things that are important to the audiences. You said that publishers are most at risk when the music stops. So what do you think will be the consequences for the industry itself? So will there be more consolidation, or as you suggested, will there be more collaboration between different types of publishers? Because what you are offering as an alternative for the future is a lot of tools that need a lot of additional experience and probably also investment. So what do you think? How exactly will that happen? Will it be, as over the last 2 or 3 decades, a wave of consolidation, focusing on less publishing companies who are really in control of those tools and who can master them? Or will there be a kind of fragmented and decentral structure out there?
Okay. I think, first of all, we have to say that our publishing noises appear loud, but they are made in a very small play pool.
That's true.
So You know, and when we talk about consolidation, I talk to researchers and scientists who are deeply shocked by the size of a Springer Nature or an Elsevier, and yet these are very small companies, even in the publishing world, or they're not large companies. They're similar in size to the trade publishing peers or other players. So I think there is room for much more consolidation. I think we'll see it. But one of the issues which will be critical will be what happens to the extensive current journal publishing activity of the scholarly societies. And in those instances where subscription is the floor upon which the whole organization stands, there is huge risk at the moment. I see more and more combines of small players. I see more and more small players in that sector looking to find alliances. IET and Wiley recently. I see more and more activity of that sort taking place. But eventually, I see less and less article publishing in the present form, and more publishing directly to the network, directly to big super caches of articles, directly to searchability. One of the startling things about scholarly publishing is how many paywalls it has.
That's true. It's not only one. That's true.
It's not only one. There's hundreds of them. So that's so that figure's big in my mind. So I think we're going to see some wholesale changes, but as always in this area, they happen slowly. Look back and you can see them. You know, it's sometimes very difficult to see them on the ground as revolutionary. It's a very evolutionary marketplace.
Here's a question from Richard Sharkin, which ties in very nicely because it points a little bit more to the economics even. So Richard asks if all of you say is true, and I think it might well be, do you think that STM publishers can continue to enjoy their current cash flows and profit? If not, what?
Well, first of all, I have to hail Richard as one of the true prophets of our time. In 2004, when I was taking my evidence for the first OA inquiry, I asked him in a public session in the House of Commons what he expected a Nature article. He was then the chief executive of Nature. What he expected a Nature article to cost as an APC. He said, so this is 15 years ago, he said £10,000. And he has come out within £1,000 of that in 15 years. So I hail Richard as a seer. But, you know, investment crowded into the scholarly publishing area because in the 90s it was perceived that very large margins could be secured, margins which were extraordinarily higher than were available elsewhere, certainly in the publishing area. Now, that investment will go elsewhere. It is inevitable that revenues will be lower. It is not, I think, inevitable that margins will always follow them. I think that once developmental work is accomplished, we can produce some respectable margins from tools and processing and information services. but I don't think they're ever going to match the market leaders of, say, 1998. And if that's the standard by which investment is attracted, investment will go elsewhere.
Yeah, let's move a little bit over to book publishers. As you can imagine, your brief remarks on reinventing the book have spurred quite some questions and speculations here. So Tara is asking you, first of all, thanks, David, extremely interesting. How do you see this playing out for HSS publishers? So assuming that they have both journals and books, but also there is a question further down. Let me check. I have to be careful here. No, let's focus on that first of all. Here's the reinvention of the monograph that Jen points out. You mentioned that as well. So how will monographs be reinvented in the near to long-term future? Maybe we can discuss the two of them together.
Well, first of all, I think in a CC/BY marketplace, in a copyright cleared marketplace, I think a lot more people will be making monographs. Make your own monograph, make a class monograph, make your pull together the articles that it's already happening. Pull together the articles that are meaningful to you. Pull together provide a little commentary. The ease with which monograph publishing can take place, and where source works can be compiled, provides a huge amount of reinvention scope. Equally, for those who see monographs as as short form works of extended research writing, the cost in the network of producing these works has fallen rapidly, will fall rapidly. So we are again looking at back at a time when 10 years ago the monograph publishing was shrinking and looked destined to disappear because nobody could cope with the costs of short-run printing. Well, over that hill, we're out of that problem. So that's an issue. HSS, well, this is where my heart lies. So my emotions say, I want to see that go on just as it is forever and a day, and nobody touches it. But actually, this, of course, is absurd. The soft sciences, the economists and the social scientists are as impacted by the data and evidence tsunami that I've described as any other area. Indeed, bringing evidential study to many areas. I'm a historian by background, and I see it strongly in statistical studies in the history domain. That's going on apace, but it will go on at a slower pace. And I think many of the things that we are saying about the sciences, which I believe are going to happen in the 5 to 7 year range, and speeded on by the pandemic and speeded on by recession, will not affect the HSS area in nearly the same sort of way. Slower, change, but slower.
Okay. Here's a question from Tiffany Moxham, and I think it's a very interesting topic, which we discussed on the Open Research Community for Open Access Week as well online. Everybody who's interested can find it there. Tiffany is asking, how do you think a mass move to open access will affect those in low and middle income countries?
Well, I think it is a very, very interesting question. I mean, part of the response is that it should make open access availability should make things cheaper and easier. On the other hand, we do
so
know,
far it doesn't.
or yeah, well, quite. We do know that that there are huge infrastructure problems, terrific difficulties of access, and many frustrations in the distribution environment. So I think the jury is really out on that. But my hope would be that providing really low cost research access will become a social, should we say, a social priority in terms of the way in which we look at the access problems of those countries.
What I found really interesting to probably add to that in the conversation I had with people from Latin America and from Africa, they all pointed at the elements that you just described, both on the consumption side, but also on the reading side, by the way, probably even more, the infrastructure challenges. But there was also this element of freedom of speech, but also freedom of science and research, which is heavily impacting open access in many countries of the world. You probably don't have to go too far, but I think it's really interesting that that was brought up, which was never really on my radar discussing these issues. So I think it's really important to see that in this whole discussion as well. David, approaching it a little bit from another side, Dana is asking you, would you be so kind to elaborate a little more on what information specialists, and she calls them librarians, will play in terms of building collections in the future? What is their role?
Well, I don't think that there is a traditional role about building collections. I think there is a role around mapping collections. And I think it's quite startling that much more of the world is digital than we think it is, partly because our ability to explore deep web environments is less good than we think it is. You know, if Google is searching through 68 billion documents, then the deep web contains what? 800 billion documents. One of the things we don't do very well is organize research pathways. I think there's a great librarian role in that area. It's not about what you have in your collection. It's the inquiry maps which you can help your scholars to compile, and the way in which you use knowledge graphs and other attributes to discover a lot of that underlying content. So I think it's a very important role there, but I think librarians move forward a place as a result of becoming a key resource for the researcher community in organizing data tools, in helping to apply technique to these to research findings. They will become publishers in many ways. Many of current publishing activities will become library activities.
That's interesting, David, and I think we should probably, in this context, go back and look at the publisher side. Philip Shaw is asking a question here. You just described the role of the librarian becoming less static, if I may say so, more liquid, or whatever that might be, the word pair there. But Philip is asking, how do you see the future role of and the significance of journals, publishers or society brands?
Did you say brand?
Yes.
Because I think that's a critical word. I think what has sustained a great deal of publishing activity alongside peer review has been this whole idea of brand. And of course, the high brand journals and their importance to reputation, etc. But also, it's possible to look at journal collections and think of second-tier journals. It's like a wine list, or indeed third-tier journals. Now, I cannot believe that those brand affiliations and those identities will remain intact if we divide articles into two, for example, in a pre-registration environment. If we move more and more into open access publishing through current transformational agreements, I think those undermine brand to a great extent. And I think the societies, they will try to retain their brand as long as they possibly can, and will have some success in doing that. But the journals themselves, especially in the commercial publishing lists, I think will become debranded. And if I recall the debates of 15 years ago, even though the high price I mentioned was quoted as the price of getting into Nature, then I think there was a fierce determination on the part of publishers at that time that they would never see their brands undermined by open access. Well, I think
that's an interesting.
I think we now have open access for about 50% of the market. Brands will be undermined.
That's an interesting point you are bringing up. So brands are obviously under pressure. I just did a research project in the UK, and there was a situation where I was in a conversation with a librarian, and I asked him, so what do you do in situations where you are running out of funding? So they were speaking about their block grants for gold open access, and the question was, what happens if the budget is suddenly used up at the end of January, but your fiscal year stops in the summer? And the answer was very clearly, well, we are directing authors to green open access, and 70% of them accept that without a huge discussion or complaints or whatever you might think of, which is not exactly what you would see as the reaction in a branded environment, right? So would you say that branding for journals, not for the top tier journals, but for the second and third tier journals, that whole notion was wishful thinking in the past, or is there something dramatically changing? Because, for example, you have better usage figures now, you can see other parameters, and from that derive more or less the importance and the relevance of the publication outlet.
Whenever I examined lists, which I did many times in the course of merger and acquisition activity, I was always deeply impressed by journal lists because the profitability increased as the brand decreased. In other words, less work was put into peer review, less editorial effort was expended, less time was spent, more money was gained. It always seemed to me to be an antithesis that we were too unaware of in our daily converse about the margins of journal publishing. I don't know. I cannot imagine in a world where you can automate proofreading, in a world where you can run all sorts of checking devices on the article where you can reduce article costs to the extent that I have indicated. I cannot actually believe that we won't sustain the margins of some journals, but actually we will increasingly begin to think about article publishing not in a journal context, but in a collection context or a database context or something not quite needing the same branded value that we've been talking about. I'm not sure that brand survives.
So in the noiseless revolution, knowledge graphs are the natural enemies of B journals and C journals?
Yeah, very much so.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that's you really need to coin that phrase of the noiseless revolution, I'm afraid. Otherwise, I'll pick it up. Maybe back to what you said in the beginning of your talk. Reading of information or for information, reading for information, I think you said, is over, is a kind of social practice for researchers, at least a social practice of the past, and it's all about machine readability. Where do you see publishers and also libraries in the progress preparing for that? Do you think we already have the right tools in place to really apply that to a middle of the road historian somewhere in the center of Germany, or is that still something also from the institutional side which is happening at top universities and causing a new competition there between centers of research?
Yeah, well, I think the latter clearly, and I think that'll be so for a number of years until we get dispersed knowledge tools, which are desktop handleable in an easy way. But I think what we're going to see in the next 5 years is a sort of war between, a rivalry between major research players about who has the best reading, digital reading skills, who has the best AI. That will then generalize to a level so that everybody has a certain standard of access to advanced tools. But in the meanwhile, I think there's yes, there are going to be leaders, and they will use that, of course, institutionally as a way of attracting key researchers, a way of attracting projects and teams and other things.
Yeah. Jody is asking a very good question here. I think that directly fits. Thank you for this. If reading for information is declining, as you say, do you see critical reading and consequently thinking, I guess, declining or rising?
I see thinking rising. The ability to sift at scale and find key inputs and think about them. I see the researchers' task clarifying, and I see the research opportunity here as a huge one. Knowing as I do, many places that I go to, that research departments are weighed down by by project administration tasks, by the huge tasks of assembling work for publication, by the huge tasks of doing literature search, by the huge tasks of actually finding out and mapping what's going on in the sector. You can take the first year or so off your research grant period, clearing the backlog, clearing the woods so that you can see a tree or two.
Yeah, and it's it's probably also true for not just critical thinking, but also for advancing science, right? Which to me always sounds a little bit abstract and hollow, but I think in the present situation, working on vaccines for COVID, we are probably all very happy that this process is a little bit faster than it used to be 15 years ago. And I assume that it would not be that fast if there would be, first of all, not that massive interest, but also the tools and the infrastructure behind it to really support this.
That's right. Yeah. But don't think we will go back after COVID. And between COVID and the next big pandemic, don't think we will go back to old ways, because we have learned something really important about scale on these problems.
Yeah. Let's turn to intermediaries in the publishing world. So we all know that there is not just the publisher, if you want, in an intermediary role between the library and the researcher, but there are also other intermediaries working between publishers and libraries or research institutions and researchers. Where do you see their role in an environment which is more and more driven by software as a service solutions, as you say, and less by buying content and organizing content in certain ways?
Well, what have we learned since the early 90s? The early 90s, I found myself doing my first research and advisory work on internet projects. And I think one of the most immediately clear things to us then, and it is deepened in significance over the years, was that that networked applications eat intermediaries. Look at it in terms of the huge movement at the moment towards RPA, towards robotic process applications. In other words, turning the world of work into a networked application. This is a vast global movement, and we in the world of publishing or in the world of scholarly communications are not immune from that. So many of the things where we support through intermediation will become automated support rather than physical support, and it'll become harder and harder to earn margins through supplying that intermediation. We're always going to need support, of course, in technology terms. So that's not going to go away. I do note, however, that the sort of technology jobbing for hire in scholarly communications is receding a little bit in favor of longer term partnerships. That's interesting. It means that people are realizing that what they called digital transformation is not a one-off event. I pay some jobbing techie to come along and digitally transform me. It's actually a lifelong relationship in which you are renewing and rebuilding the technology through time.
Mm-hmm. There's this very influential book, The Wealth of Networks, which is, by the way, lying under my screen here right now and putting the screen a little bit up. But I was thinking while you were talking about the wealth of networks, what about those networks that have sprung out over the last years, which are more social networks like ResearchGate, for example, or academia.edu? How do you see their role in the future in relation to publishing activity, more or less, which we have been discussing?
Very important, and I think social networking is in an area like scholarly communications is of huge importance. But we have to find out what its key attributes are. It does seem to me that the foothills of this are finding you a new job or selling you a used washing machine. We've got to get beyond that point to things which are vital to you in your daily life, which make it important for you to check that box and see what your colleagues are doing or what they're saying with a real vitality. I don't think, as long as we're advertising based in those networks, I don't think we're getting there yet.
No, I agree. And I think really combining a social network and a publication output, basically, that people are generating, to me, that's really the essence of those applications. We have time for a few more questions, and please use the chat function. I think it's great that we had a little bit less time or spent a little bit less time, at least at the beginning. David, before we continue with the next question, I think everybody has seen that Researchercentric is not just of the opinion that the APC should be £10,000, but £30,000 when you had that conversation several years back. So maybe you need to update the hard drive there and keep in that new number.
No, I have the original report.
Oh, okay. But I think what's really interesting is that the idea, the notion that Richard is also bringing up, which is that we are not just paying publishers for the service of what we see, but also all the harm that they prevent, basically, through peer review or other selection criteria, whether it's human beings doing that or technology. I think that's really interesting. One little story, I had a conversation with my mother, who is in her 70s, a few weeks ago, and she told me about something she had read on COVID research in her daily newspaper, a local newspaper. And she said, I have to be careful with the information because it was not peer-reviewed yet, which I found really an interesting statement. And she used the English word peer-reviewed. I was kind of surprised that my mother knows about peer review at 75. But in any case, you also spoke about more information and more justification of public money going into research, and that is clearly a role that funders will focus on in the next time. Maybe you can expand a little bit on that. How do you see that role being carried out?
Well, yeah. First of all, I'd like to say, I don't know whether you have explained this to your mother. I would have had grave doubts in explaining it to mine. I wonder if you could distinguish between peer review as performed by PLOS ONE or Nature Communications. That is a technical review, which says the methodology was an orthodox one, which says that the experiment was conducted in a proper way, which says that the findings have been created in a proper way, and that the conclusions, if the experiment was correct, are drawn correctly from it. Now, that's one sort of peer review, but it's not what a lot of other people describe as peer review. And it does seem to me that we continually utilize the expressions where they're most convenient for us to either create new levels of rigor or to explain away why we're doing something entirely technical. As to the sort of PLOS ONE Nature Communications type of peer review, I'm quite confident that that can be machine performed in a very short time. That seems to me to be not a high hurdle. On the other hand, I want to ask this question about publicly funded research. So the Dutch government or the German government or whoever it may be has decided that they want to invest in research in a particular area. They undertake due diligence. They find the best team in Germany to do this. They invite proposals. They take in ideas from other places. They build the best team. They fund them. They set them on a 5-year course. At the end of that time, an article appears which summarizes the research findings. Do we really expect that article to go through a full peer review process, or do we expect that actually the real peer review for that article will be the way people react to it once it is available? Equally, we all know that some research fails to light any fireworks on publication, but can become vitally important in 5 years' time when trends reach that point, or when that particular approach to a problem becomes fashionable, or when it's recognized that the author of that paper was a pure genius. So tracking research over time rather than at point of publication could be one of the most important open science attributes. It could be that one of the ways we use our knowledge graph is to see how reputations are changing, and that the change in reputations may be much more important than the initial reputation. And these factors all lead me to think that publication, that peer review at point of publication is going to come under some pretty heavyweight attack, especially if it is seen in delay terms.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks a lot, David. Are there any further questions from the audience? Otherwise, I'll give you another 30 seconds or so. Please type them into the chat function. But I think otherwise, David, you have given us a great introduction into our conference, our virtual conference here. I'm really glad that we weren't distracted by your video, but just had a chance to see your photo. We are obviously looking forward to see you in person again at the next conference. And let's make sure that a good bottle of red wine, like A+ peer reviewed, reaches you soon. Thank you very much for contributing today. And everybody else, thank you for listening. Thanks for your questions.